Have you ever heard of a king buying 40 women at once, like cattle? Because that's what Pharaoh Amenhotep III did. He straight up ordered a shipment of perfect girls from a foreign ruler. Then he paid in silver. But here's the thing, those women weren't wives. They weren't queens either. No, they were slaves, brought in to be used, owned, and forgotten. But who exactly were these women? And what exact fate awaited these enslaved concubine women in ancient Egypt? The big picture. Indeed, ancient Egyptian records don't sugarcoat things. A lot of concubines were foreign women, captives taken in war or traded into slavery. Military campaigns in places like Nubia, Libya, and Canaan were people gathering missions as much as they were about land. Pharaohs brought back prisoners, then labeled them living captives. And then they put them to work. Yes, hard labor was common. So was handing them out as rewards. A little something for the generals. After all, enslaving conquered people was policy. One scroll, Papyrus Harris No. 1, which was basically a royal brag sheet from Rameses III, goes all in. He claims he brought back wives and children in tens of thousands, which wasn't exactly understated. But then he had them branded and enslaved. Concubines also came through purchase, or as diplomatic gifts. In one letter from the Amarna archives, Amenhotep III strikes a deal with the king of Gaza. He shells out 160 daben, think silver, gold, and trade goods, for 40 concubines. And he's picky. He asks for very beautiful concubines without blemish. So, basically, the ancient equivalent of swiping right on a dating app. Then there are household records, like Papyrus Brooklyn 35, 1446, from the 13th dynasty. It lists dozens of Asiatic women working in elite homes. One vizier's wife had 95 of them. And sure, they're called household servants. But let's be real, some of them likely served as concubines too. And you know, some of these concubines came via the Mediterranean slave trade, which was often run by Semitic traders. Asia Minor was a common source, so Egypt, it seems, had a steady pipeline. Legal status and autonomy. Now, by law, a concubine slave had almost zero rights. She wasn't a legal wife, so there was no marriage contract, no dowry, and no legal standing. A later Egyptian text sums it up in one line. The wife has a marriage contract. The concubine has none. So she couldn't own property. She could be sold, inherited, or passed around like furniture. And her children? They didn't get any special status. That child didn't inherit the father's status. It inherited hers. So, if the mother was a slave, so was the kid. Full stop. And there was no automatic freedom, and no change in status, no matter who the father was. Unlike later Islamic law, Egypt didn't offer manumission just because a child was born. So, in other words, concubines in ancient Egypt had no status at all. If a woman was enslaved and given to a man, like, say, a pharaoh or a noble, she became his property, legally, entirely. He could sleep with her, punish her, or even get rid of her whenever he wanted. Again, she had no legal rights, no say, no protection. It was like she wasn't really there, legally speaking. Now, the word often used for concubines was the two-lettered word, which meant servant or slave. Same word, basically. And every once in a while, one of these women rose way, way above her station. Take Mutemwia. She was a concubine of Thutmose IV, and somehow she became regent when her son, Amenhotep III, was still a kid. She effectively ruled Egypt, and once her son took the throne, she was honored with queenly titles. But let's be clear, that kind of outcome is extremely rare, because most concubines lived a very different kind of life. Daily life and treatment. So, what did that life actually look like? In a single word, forbidding. As we've gathered so far, concubines weren't free to say no. By definition, they were forced intimate partners. It was part of the job. And they didn't just serve in bed. They cooked. They wove cloth. They did hair. They cleaned. They fetched and carried. They served the household in every possible way. That letter from Amenhotep III that we mentioned earlier, it spells this out. He wanted concubines who were not only beautiful and flawless, but also weavers. So yeah, consorts and textile workers, all in one. And again, because they had no legal protections, their owners could beat them. Or worse, without any consequence. Archaeological records confirm that. Foreign-born slaves were often flogged, and concubines weren't spared. In fact, one Middle Kingdom account gives us a chilling detail. An Asiatic slave girl describes being severely beaten by her master for some minor offense, and it wasn't isolated. Texts from the time mention that Asiatic slaves, especially women, were regularly mistreated. And since concubines had no status at all, there was nothing to stop the abuse. They could be punished, starved, or worked into exhaustion, and no one would bat an eye. So yes, a concubine might spend part of her day spinning thread. But the rest? It could be anything her master wanted. And no one was coming to help her. But besides these specifics, historical sources sketch how concubines fit into palace life. You see, in the royal imagination, concubines weren't just abstract figures, for they were seen as very real women, living in very real quarters. Sometimes whole sections of palaces were set aside for them. Take Amenhotep III's Malkata Palace. It had an entire wing just for the harem. And, because it's ancient Egypt, of course there was also a private temple tucked in nearby. Priorities. And hey, if these concubines ended up on the wrong side of politics, things could turn fatal. There's an infamous example, the so-called harem conspiracy. This was a palace-level Game of Thrones, with real blood. But let's not jump ahead. First, some context. Again, personal stories from concubines were pretty rare. They're mostly invisible in the records, anonymous, unnamed. What we do have, however, are bits and pieces. Administrative files, trial records, and some very tense letters. Then, fast forward a couple centuries, the reign of Rameses III, around 1155 BC. Here things get messy. According to the Turin Judicial Papyrus, a group of concubines and their sons plotted to kill the pharaoh. One of the leaders was a woman named Queen Tia Merenes, along with her son, Prince Pentava. It's all laid out in the court records. Magic spells, poison, plots in the dark. But it didn't go well for them. They were caught. tortured. Then they were put on trial. Pentuer, the prince, was forced to commit suicide. Others were executed. And Rameses III? Well, despite official claims that the plot failed, his mummy has a huge slash across the throat. So, yeah, it didn't fail entirely. The papyrus even lists other women of the pharaoh's harem as part of the plot. So, it's a rare case where names appear. Well, we can trace the fallout, and it shows something pretty chilling. As you're already aware by now, a concubine could be favored one day and dead the next. All it took was the wrong alliance. A little ambition, or someone else's ambition, dragging them down with it. And when it comes to concubine slaves and how their lives ended, the record is basically blank. Unlike royal wives, they didn't get tombs with lavish inscriptions. No statues or grand send-offs either. No monument saying, "Here lies so-and-so, favored companion of the king." Just silence and blankness. And occasionally, tombs of wealthy elites include slave burials. But even then, there's no clear label saying, "This one was a concubine." So most likely, when concubines died, they did so without a trace. And if their master died first, they might be sold off, or given away like furniture, or, if things really went south, they'd get executed. And the fact that no one even bothered to carve their names in stone says a lot about what we mentioned before, that they weren't seen as people worth remembering, that they were simply property, to be used and forgotten. And in the end, here's where things stand. Concubine slaves were real. Their lives were usually short on power, recognition, or control. But because the evidence is so spotty, a lot of the details are educated guesses. And when the documents fall silent, which they often do, we have to admit we just don't know. However, no evidence doesn't always mean it didn't happen. But it does mean we can't say for sure. So yes, based on everything we've covered in this episode, it's clear that concubines in ancient Egypt faced a tragic fate most of us today can't even imagine.